If you're ready. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our continuing Brown Bag Lecture Series. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Brian Daniels. Brian Daniels received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania's Joint Anthropology and History doctoral program. Currently, he's the Director of Research and Programs for the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He's a visiting professor in Sustainable Cultural Heritage graduate program at the American University of Rome and a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Daniels' research program has prioritized community engagement, outreach, and cultural documentation. He is a cultural heritage specialist, and as an expert in cultural heritage policy, his work extends into fields and regions that may be considered unconventional to academic specialties. For example, he's worked for over 18 years with Native American communities on issues related to political sovereignty, cultural appreciation, and heritage preservation. He is also a co-director of the Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project, which aims to enhance the protection of cultural heritage by supporting professionals, activists in conflict areas. In addition to this, he leads the National Science Foundation-supported Conflict Culture Research Network, a group of 17 international universities and research organizations focused on the study of intentional cultural destruction. And he has regularly appeared before the U.S. Cultural Property Advisory Committee at the U.S. Department of State. So it's clear from these diverse projects that Dr. Daniels is a boots-on-the-ground figure in global cultural heritage preservation and at the forefront of cultural heritage policy. His experiences demonstrate that the nature of cultural heritage studies is bridging the divide between academia, Native communities, the public, international community, national and international policies, and something which we know is really essential in our current political climate. For this work, he has received the Society for American Archaeology's Presidential Recognition Award for his efforts to protect Syrian and Iraqi cultural heritage. He also received the Lynn Ryer Award in Tribal Community Development from the Society for the Preservation of American Indian Culture for his work with Shasta Indian communities in Northern California. Today, he'll be talking about Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and his talk is titled Thinking About Cultural Heritage Now, the work of the Penn Cultural Heritage Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniels.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that generous introduction. And indeed, it really is a pleasure to be with everyone here today to talk about something that is, of course, very near and dear to my heart, and that is community-based cultural heritage preservation and some of the projects that I help lead and coordinate through the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Alicia asked me today to talk specifically about community-based heritage engagement because of the salience that it has in so many different contexts, both political, academic, educational. Indeed, it's really hard to imagine classroom work now that doesn't involve some kind of inquisition or interrogation about cultural heritage terms and cultural heritage ethics. But I wanted, by way of introduction to talking about the kind of substantive community-based approach that our own center takes, to think for just a moment and by way of preface about the kinds of context that cultural heritage has right now. And I think in many ways, cultural heritage has come through three sort of iterative phases. The first, I think, grew out of traditional humanities-based inquisition and the kind of work that the Academy has done for so long surrounding the humanities, cultural collections, and so on. And, I mean, this is the kind of the traditional humanist education. And this, of course, ran something aground, as it were, in the 1980s, 1990s with the culture wars, and the kind of broad defunding concerns that we have across the Academy today and indeed across political Washington and the kind of funding landscape that concern us all about the future of organizations like the NEH and the NEA. So on the one hand, I think that there is a very tradition-bound approach to the humanities that cultural heritage sort of lives firmly within, and we might see this as a node of historic preservation, we might see this as collections management, we might see this as the care of objects, buildings, collections that are historic in nature that we feel very comfortable with, and especially in in institutions such as this one or my own at the University of Pennsylvania or the Smithsonian. I think, though, that again in the 90s, partly in reaction to the culture wars, partly in reaction to the kind of ethical concerns and considerations that come up in good humanistic inquiry. There was a moment that began where we really began to question our ethics, and we began to try and foreground law. And so if we think about the ethical reappraisals that began to happen in the 1990s and 2000s, maybe starting with perhaps the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and extending to how we think about ethics of museum collections and ethics of collecting. There was a legal moment, too, in cultural heritage when so much research obtained around what we might consider law, what we might consider ethics, and that continues today in different kinds of ways. The Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act of 2016, which passed Congress last year. So there is a legal aspect and an ethical aspect to cultural heritage studies and research. But I think that there's a third aspect, and it's the third aspect I want to dwell on today. And it is how we actually make the humanities public. And I think that there is a move, an urgency among the undergraduates and graduate students I teach. And certainly I think in talking to postdocs and faculty around this table and the conversations I had this morning, to try and figure out how cultural heritage preservation action extends beyond the academy, beyond its traditional institutions, and beyond even the confines of ethics and law. To really think about what engagement means and what the public outreach of humanities is. And I think that in many ways, cultural heritage fits this present moment need. When we're talking about how we actually make the humanities public and try and actually interest people in the humanities more generally, oftentimes we're appealing to cultural heritage because it seems like it's a good entree into these other kinds of inquiries. It seems like there's a sense of urgency among local communities to talk about how you protect important cultural sites, places, artifacts, and so on. In fact, there is something about the identity making of this particular globalized and perhaps threatened moment about cultural heritage preservation that I think makes this topic seem especially urgent. And the work that I do with the Penn Cultural Heritage Center in many ways is designed to respond to this last piece. It's an initiative of the Penn Museum to try and figure out how to make, as it were, the humanities and the museum public, to follow up on the museum's long-standing commitments to being a leader in museum ethics. So in many ways, the center is somewhat experimental, for better or for worse, in trying to figure out how to actually make the humanities public, make the museum public, and advance this broader kind of mission of museum ethics. And the way that we have actually approached this at the Penn Cultural Heritage Center is to think about how communities external to the museum value cultural heritage. And if we think about cultural heritage writ broadly, we can sort of define two distinct categories that emerge both theoretically in the literature but also in practice. And one is what has been called by Laura Jane Smith and others authoritative heritage discourse. And these are the legal considerations, the laws, the UNESCO conventions and technical recommendations that actually circumscribe and specifically define what heritage is. You think about our Section 106 process in the United States or the other kinds of guidance we have about the preservation of collections. On the other side to this, though, and contrasted, is what has been called in the literature community-based cultural heritage. And what's key about this sort of category is that it's not necessarily defined by the same kind of legal categories or other considerations that we get from laws and such. Instead, this is what local community members define as the most important objects in their communities, their towns, in highly localized settings. And who have oftentimes sort of been forgotten by broader moves toward cultural heritage preservation. And this is of, I think, a special concern to archaeologists. And I do count myself as an archaeologist most of the time, in that there's a need to actually respond to what kinds of heritages are being articulated by that community, and to think about how we as academics can help support those communities in those localized preservation actions. And so in many ways, this responds to theoretical moves in what we call community and indigenous archaeologies. And this is a very loose and very nebulous term, and I've given a range of definitions here about what community or indigenous archaeology might be, which varies very much about what we think of as community heritage. And I think that some of the key pieces here that are important as we sort of go forward in this consideration in the 3 case studies I'm going to outline for you is that we think about how community-based heritage preservation can be a political statement that's concerned with issues of highly localized sovereignty, issues of identity making, issues of empowerment, and political resistance. And so there is a political project here at the very local level among particularly disenfranchised communities toward cultural heritage preservation. And in this way, we can actually think of these kinds of projects as being a certain kind of critique. So I am going to go through 3 different projects that the Penn Cultural Heritage Center sponsors and supports. The first is the Tihosuco Community Heritage Project, which is based in the Yucatan, Mexico. The second is the Weyka Heritage Project, based in Northern California. And the third is a Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project, which quite obviously takes place in Syria and Iraq literally, but involves a transnational configuration in order to make it operative. So I want to begin here, again with the question of how communities value heritage. And I mean, what you're looking at here is a ruined church. One of the monuments remaining from the caste war in Mexico. And one of the questions that the Tihosuco Community Heritage Project is really trying to wrestle with is how we deal with what constitutes the culture of the Maya. And so often when we talk about the Maya, the preservation of Maya heritage, what comes to mind in public discourse and in international representation are the preservation of monumental sites of the ancient Maya. And the question really that we need to ask ourselves if we're thinking about this at a community level is, how do local modern Maya people interact with those ancient sites? Are those as important to those local community members as they are to the international community? And it turns out for many Maya communities in the Yucatan, the answer is yes, those monuments are important and we understand that we're connected to them, but they're also not the most important thing to us. And the answer for them is the remaining artifacts related to a rebellion called the Caste War. And this monumental church is one of the remainders of the Caste War. So is this statue to Jacinto Pat, one of the leaders of the Caste War rebellion, who is a local hero in the Yucatan for leading what was one of the most successful Maya rebellions, or most successful indigenous rebellions, in fact, in the Americas, that went on from roughly 1847 until a limited peace treaty was signed in 1901. That is commemorated by local communities across the Yucatan, oftentimes in public spaces not occupied or articulated the same way by the tourists who come to see the more famous Maya archaeological sites. And so the Tihosuco Community Heritage Project is very much an elastic project. It's trying to respond and understand what the artifacts, what the buildings, what the sites, what the heritage is that's important to local Maya communities to protect here, focused around the site of Tihosuco and Quintana Roo. And there's an outpouring of art. There's an outpouring of visual representation that exists around this particular rebellion. You're getting a sense here of the overall space. It is just to the west of Cancun, about 2 hours from the heartland of the Maya Riviera, but again, an area that doesn't see the same kind of tourist flow. It really is very much in the space of the Yucatan jungle. And so one of the pieces here is to engage with the museum, to think about the curation of what this conflict actually looks like from the Maya perspective of the people who suffered through the conflict, who survived, and who ultimately led this successful rebellion. And this is community-based curation of objects that are found in the fields, the remnants of the artifacts from this particular conflict that have particular salience to local landholders in the ejido. And so one of the tasks that the community has asked for, and that I think is the operative key here, this is the community asking for this kind of work, is an archaeological survey of what the sites are surviving from this conflict. I mean, a very basic question when you actually think about it, but I mean, this is historic archaeology. The town of Tela here has been surveyed. It's an abandoned town inside the jungle. This was essentially Hasentopat's capital during the rebellion. Entirely abandoned, probably abandoned around 1910. And it's been curated by the local ejido in the forest, out of concern that there would be intruders or damage, people who are not respective of how important this particular site is and the surviving architecture to it. And what you're looking at here is some of the standing architecture that remains from the haciendas and the church chapels that are still in Tela. This is still used as a site of community veneration once a year. And this is my colleague, Richard Leventhal, talking with and meeting with community members at that church site, trying to understand more about it and engage in the kind of research process. And I'm particularly fond of this photograph here for the reason that it highlights what so much of the community heritage work actually is and how difficult it is, in that it involves a lot of listening. It does not involve as much archaeological talking. It involves really sitting down, spending the time, and talking with not just stakeholders, but community residents to understand what it is that they care about. And so when he's in the field, when I'm in the field, when our colleagues and our graduate students are in the field, this is so much about an active listening process to what is being defined locally. It's as much ethnographic as it is archaeological in many kinds of ways. And so this is the research team for the Tihosuco Heritage Project. And I think that one of the things that you can see here is it's dominated by local community members. This is a project that they asked for, that we articulated and designed in collaboration with the community leaders, but also families, individual people, through a broad process of consultation. Now, what that initial sort of archaeological site survey has evolved into, though, is I think the crux of what community-based heritage is. It takes on many other aspects and many other kinds of heritage-based preservation that go beyond the kind of buildings-based conservation and research that archaeologists might be interested in. So there was an interest in developing an oral history project that grew out of this. Interest in creating a community archive center of the important documents of the town. Interest, as I said earlier, about redoing the museum, recurating the museum, and developing guides, not just in Spanish, but in Maya and in English for the rare odd tourist that comes in from Cancun. There was interest, too, in surveying the surviving colonial architecture that in the main city of Tihosuco, not in the jungle, and recording what this is. And this is a space where the Mexican government, INA itself, has had less interest in actually doing this kind of more historic conservation or more historic documentation. There was interest, too, then in how you preserve this particular dialect of Maya spoken in Tihosuco, and developing programmatic educational tools that could be used in classrooms for Maya. This particular project led to a group of teenagers decided that they wanted to create a set of comic books in Maya about the caste war. And you're looking here at one of the images from those comic books that then circulated around the community. This sprung into a public radio project that again is supported as part of this. I mean, so this is how these community-based projects suddenly generate many, many daughter kinds of projects and related kind of projects, because there's interest at the local level in this kind of preservation activity, but it's the actualization. I mean, it might be that the archaeology is just the entree into these other kinds of dialogues that are in many ways latent, but looking to be sprung into existence. Another project is an old photo project from community members, collecting and digitizing those. And then I think one of the more intriguing pieces that sprung out of the old photo documentation project, Maya members, the local community members, asked if they could have their own photo documentation project, but not in the kind of National Geographic style of photo documentation. They wanted to pose themselves, they wanted to set the backgrounds, they wanted to decide and control the fate of their own representation, and to have the photographs that came out of the project. And so this is the autobiographical photo project of this. This is an image of an elderly couple here, but there are obviously others. So all in all, what does the Tihosuco Community Project represent? Well, in many ways, I think it represents, again, as I said, the tie of what happens when you actually start with the question, what kinds of heritage are relevant to you? How, as outsiders to this space, can we engage with you and work with you to do the kinds of research projects that you would like to see realized? Whether they're more traditionally conservation, whether they're more based around the development of resources for museums, whether around recuration, whether they're in very much formal conservation styles. It's not as if we suddenly are not scientists by being in this space. What it is we're starting with a different question, the question that the community wants to begin with, not necessarily the question that I would start with as an archaeologist. And that, I think, has altered the dynamic to a large degree. Let me talk about the Weyka Heritage Project now, and this is a project based in Northern California with an indigenous community there. And it's based along the Klamath River Basin, which is right on the border of California and Oregon. You're looking at a map here, and this is the third largest river drainage after the Columbia and Sacramento rivers on the West Coast. And what we're dealing with here is the native community that lives in this rough midsection of the river basin right here in these valleys. Now, without going into a long and dramatic rehearsal of Native American law and history, we suffice to say we know that it is bad, and we know that Native American peoples were displaced, killed, or evacuated to reservations under incredibly difficult circumstances across the country. And this is not a new story to this space, except that gold was discovered right here. And so the experience of Shasta people, Shasta language speakers who were in this space, was refracted through the discovery of gold and the dispossession of gold that happened. And so some of the more traditional reservation projects that are more typical to Native American law and history in the United States simply did not happen here because of a degree of displacement. Native peoples were forced to very marginal land use areas and were settled in really very difficult to get to parts of this landscape to try and continue their lifeways as much as possible, with the result that Shasta people in this space are not a federally recognized tribal community. And so under federal Indian law, you have federally recognized tribes and federally unrecognized tribes. And below that, there are state recognized and state unrecognized tribes. Shasta are a state recognized tribe, but not a federally recognized tribe in large part of this disruptive history. And so one of the issues here is how you deal with cultural heritage preservation among a community that has been so radically disrupted by historical events that were beyond their control. The exploitation of gold, the reclamation of land for dam construction, and then the dispersal of these communities in such a way that it was very difficult to maintain any kind of cultural or linguistic cohesion. And so the questions here are very much one of recovery, about how you reintroduce these kinds of reintroduce culture to a community that in many ways has been separated from it by the vicissitudes of history and this very kind of bitter series of events, but also to be a platform for advancing tribal interests related to the political preservation of their lands, their burial grounds, the sacred sites that are known. And so the tack that we've taken here is actually very different in many ways, but you'll still very different in many ways, but very similar in others to what was going on in Mexico. It's different in that the community here is widely dispersed, and so the act of a project actually brings people together. But the kinds of methodological techniques of engagement are very similar to what you just heard in Mexico. Only here it's been very much about bringing the community together to try and understand some of these important places within the cultural landscapes of Northern California. Here we're actually visiting the grave at the bottom here of one of the last traditional headmen, Ahicampec. Here we're taking a site visit actually to, although you won't be able to, this is a site that you wouldn't know is a site unless you knew it was a site, but we're actually standing in a graveyard of the great-grandparents of everybody in that photograph. And this is what I mean by how quickly that kind of cultural knowledge can actually evaporate in the kind of fraught Native American historical space. These great-grandchildren did not know that their great-grandparents were buried here, even though the village site that this community had lived at is 100 meters from this location and had been occupied until 1940. So I mean, there were incredible breaks in continuity of knowledge here. And this all takes place at the this photograph is from the graveyard of a landmark prominent in Shasta folklore called Anirurihana. And this is it's glossed in English as the woman who went bad. Bad in the sense of being sexually promiscuous. Shasta stories can get a little racy. But this was a very important rock in Shasta coyote stories and in broader Shasta folklore. And this is the last traditional headman, a man named Bogus Tom, and his wife Isabel. And so in many ways it's about refinding where these spaces are and reintroducing them into the cultural topography and knowledge of contemporary Shasta people now. And this means actually wrestling with the histories of very difficult places. And here, we're actually on a hike, which actually resulted in T-shirts that said, "I survived Brian's insane hike." But up to this cave, where all of the surviving every surviving Shasta member now has an ancestor who overwintered in this cave and survived an assault by California miners on this particular cave. And so what you're looking at, the kind of debris, is you're looking at actually the detritus from howitzer shells that were lobbed at the cave where this Indian community was staked out during the winter. And this is a site that had been lost to the knowledge of the community. And again, this was about going back to the space and reclaiming the space and being able to actually restore what that indigenous history is for this particular community. And this is just upriver of the cave, another example of the same process. This is from a cadastral map from the 1880s, and you can see Indian village right here, remains of Indian village. Again, the remains were the folks who had moved to the cave over about here. But that village site is right here. And one of the reasons why I like showing this photograph is that one of the prominent surviving Shasta families grew up in that building right here, adjacent to where that traditional village site was, but did not necessarily know that the traditional home site was there. There was some awareness that it was somewhere in the neighborhood, but not that it was literally there, because the grandmother, the mother here, effectively, of the children had been killed when her children were all under the age of 7. And so these kinds of cultural disruptions get introduced, but at the same time, there's still a desire to re-embed and reinvigorate them, and to actually revisit these spaces in the landscape. But it also, the process of actually undergoing those acts of cultural reclamation lead to unexpected discoveries and unexpected knowledges coming out of the woodwork, as it were. And there was one traditional Shasta practitioner whose family I actually knew well, but although I had never met her, because she kind of always kept privately alone. And 2 years ago, she approached me and said, I know you've been coming up here for 16 years. And there's something I now trust you, because you've been coming back here for 16 years to show you. And what she wanted to show me was actually this landscape here, which is a large-scale prayer site with stone feature construction. A massive, there's small-scale stone feature construction across Northern California, but only a couple examples in the Pacific Northwest where there is significant stonework construction, specifically for different kinds of segregated prayer area. And this is one of those sites. Her grandfather was the last traditional headman of this area, not Bogus Tom, who was in a different area, but this is a different space. Bullhead was his name. And this has been kept totally within her family. And she was the last surviving member of her family who knew about it, and she's in very ill health. And she said, I'm really scared that I'm going to die and no one is going to know about the site, and I feel like you can reintroduce it to the rest of the community now, because you have this longevity of interaction. And I'm not sure how many of you work in Native American spaces, but there's probably some awareness for everyone that Native American religious sites are especially fraught and difficult to work in for academics because of the long-standing colonial relationships and fraught history between anthropologists, archaeologists, and Native Americans. And this, I think that the fact that this project has suddenly evolved just from that kind of cultural reclamation piece, which is in itself very significant and very important, into the space that is now talking about how you both preserve this religious site, but also try and understand the kind of religious conceptions that were at that site and reintroduce that knowledge more broadly. It's reflective, I think, of where the best kind of academic research can go between Native communities and the academy now. But it involves a long-standing commitment and a kind of respect. So what we've started here, and we'll continue again this summer, is actually a full-scale survey, not unlike what you say at Tila, of what these stone features are in this landscape, to try and understand, the Native what the Native American construction of the site was, how Shasta people interacted with the site, and the kinds of religious practices they brought to bear. Already, we've been able to see how different rock art at the site aligns with different star formations that are important in Shasta cosmology, and there's enough surviving in the traditional practitioner's account. She had learned from her father and her grandfather. This had been a place where Shasta people went to observe, to do night watch, to observe moon, to observe sunrise and sunset. But exactly what that means, she did not know. And so there's a question of knowledge reclamation here, of trying to actually bring, really good archaeological survey technique to bear to try and understand some of these indigenous derived questions. So finally, I want to turn to the Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq project. And this project is probably what the Penn Cultural Heritage Center is known for the most. But I want to preface it by saying that I have never thought of this project in my own mind as particularly different from what was going on in Mexico or what was going on in California with the Shasta. To my mind, this was always at the forefront an indigenous archaeology project and a community archaeology project or heritage project because it takes place in Syria and Iraq. It takes place in conflict-affected spaces. Though I'm not going to Syria and I'm not going to Iraq. In some ways, when we talk about loosening the binds of professional control and working with our collaborators, this is the absolute extreme of that. My position in co-directing this project is simply to enable Syrian and Iraqi local community members to preserve the cultural heritage that they feel able to protect and the heritage that they identify as being the most important. And those are two different things here. And one of the things I often say in this project, to the participants in the project, is we know that important cultural heritage is going to be destroyed and has. This doesn't change in this project. What we can do is actually only do what we're able to do. And so Aleppo may be lost, but maybe not a museum nearby. And that's a very, very hard thing for a lot of people to swallow, especially on this side of the Atlantic. I think that Syrians and Iraqis have a pretty good handle on that after this many years of conflict and turmoil. This project is also quite large, and it involves a number of international organizations and institutions, which is absolutely necessary of doing a project of this scale. And it really grew out, as I'll explain, of, like the Shasta project and the Mexico project, a request from the local community. But I'll also say that this particular project requires a substantial amount of funding and investment in infrastructure. There was a moment on this project that required 16 different permits from 3 different countries and international organizations, and among even subunits of countries that ministries that will veto permits if that particular other ministry grants a permit. This is an immensely complicated project. So this project really grew out of Salam al-Kuntar, who you're seeing here in the front, who was a deputy director for archaeology for the Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums in Syria, who was threatened with arrest for protesting the Assad regime in 2012 and fled to the United States under the auspices of the Scholars at Risk program. And when she came to the United States, she asked Syrian and Iraqi archaeologists if they would be willing to undertake an emergency community-based program in Syria. And she was uniformly turned down. This wasn't, heritage preservation wasn't something the archaeological community did, she was told. And so finally she approached me and Richard and said, I know that you run these community projects in the Western Hemisphere. What about doing this in Syria? And for me, that was, this question, I think, was so mind-numbing in many ways, that first of all, that there would be such reticence among the professional community at the moment when cultural destruction is at its height to actually not engage in this issue. To me, was just absolutely ethically abhorrent. But I also don't know how you can call yourself concerned with cultural heritage at the present moment and not be intellectually engaged in some capacity on what's going on in the MENA region more broadly. And so we said, well, let's figure out how we can actually do a project. And the request came from inside Syria, can we actually come with, Syrian conservators and archaeologists are very highly trained, usually by French or German organizations. So this isn't an issue of a knowledge deficit. In many ways, it was a structural issue of supplies and money to undertake emergency work. In many ways, what we all should be good at, right? How we actually run permits and how we actually do import and export control over materials. There was some concern about how you do emergency evacuation here. And this is my colleague Robert Patterson from the National Museum of the American Indian, who was responsible for the move from the collections downtown to Washington, D.C. He was actually the head mover, who came and did an emergency demonstration with a group from Syria that came out to Gaziantep, Turkey. We went shopping at the Turkish equivalent of Home Depot, bought supplies to re-enter into Syria. but most of all, and I think crucially, had a dialogue about what kinds of emergency heritage projects were possible. And this is in June 2014. And one of the pieces that came back, as I said before, was Aleppo may not be possible, Idlib may not be possible, but this Mosaic museum is possible. The Mara Mosaic Museum, a repository of collections from the ancient cities of northern Syria, often called the Dead Cities. And so what we did here, after consulting conservators in the United States, was really to do how do you actually preserve a massive mosaic collection that can't move inside a museum? Well, you put glue down on it, put flash bump polyurethane fabric or cotton batting on it, and then sandbag it. And I mean, this is the image. This is the image that showed up in my inbox on New Year's Day 2015. When the sandbagging of the museum had been complete. And it worked. The museum was bombed by the Assad regime in 2015, later in 2015. And the sandbags did exactly what the sandbags were supposed to do. They blew off the walls and probably offered some structural support. It was bombed by the Russians in 2016. And again, although the building itself was more damaged in this particular bombing, again, the Mosaic collection survived. And so this is a process that we've repeated across Syria at other sites. So here you're looking at emergency site stabilization at the Bronze Age city of Ebla, which was undercut by looters' tunnels and threatened with collapse during the rainy season. And I want to, this man here is now public, and so I'll introduce him to you. His name is Ayman Nabu, and he's the local community leader who leads this project inside Syria, and has brought together a group of curators, archaeologists, and other interested members of the public who simply want to engage in these emergency preservation actions. And I asked at one point one of them, why do you do this? I'm talking to you in Turkey. You could stay here. Why do you do this? And this wasn't Ayman, but it was one of his friends. He said, the regime has already declared that I should die. I could die at any time from a barrel bomb. But I want my grandchildren to know that I tried to save something of our identity. And I think that describes the motivating piece here, and for me, why I think it's important for the international community here, of us as archaeologists and conservators and so on, to engage. And there's a really key political aspect here too that I'll highlight. And so this is one special initiative called the Hekayya Heritage Initiative, the Stories Initiative, that takes place in the dead city of Al-Bara. And in 2014, there was a meeting at UNESCO in which there was some discussion and concern raised by UNESCO that the IDP community that had moved into these archaeological sites was damaging to the archaeological sites. I mean, the community had moved, these refugees had moved there because, for very obvious reasons. There was some assumption that the archaeological site might not be bombed. There are already pre-existing ruins that are warm in the winter and cold in the summer, and it was a safe place for these refugees to reorganize. And UNESCO was proposing actually displacing the refugees from the archaeological site. And I knew that in all likelihood these few thousand people would not be displaced if there was a heritage program active among this community. UNESCO would politically be unable to remove them. And so we launched a program here at the Dead Cities in order to actually prevent the displacement of these refugee communities. And this was very much a local engagement practice to make sure that these sites were protected as much as possible. And where we made our mode of entree here was in the schools. Working with a French NGO that had established schools inside the Al-Bara Archaeological Park, but working with these communities to take children out to the site, talk about their perceptions of why this was important, and to offer some education about these Byzantine ruins, to encourage the production of traditional craft and straw work by the local women in these communities with traditional Homsi patterns. A lot of the refugees are from Homs. and to generally do what we could to help stabilize this archaeological site, while the IDP community is there. Now, I want to say something about how this project transitioned into Iraq, because obviously this was a Syria project to start. And then when ISIS erased the border between Syria and Iraq, all of a sudden it felt as though Iraq was on our plate too. And a lot of the work in northern Iraq in terms of conservation and archaeological survey has been done through the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil. And this photograph was actually taken by my colleagues Catherine Hansen and Jesse Johnson as ISIS was bearing down on the Erbil plain in August of 2014, and they had to evacuate out because it was not, after ISIS took Mosul, it was not clear that ISIS was also not going to take Erbil. ISIS did not take Erbil because of the intervention of U.S. bombing, but it was until the summer of 2015, when the political circumstances had entirely changed in Iraq, that once again there could be emergency conservation training. And this is where we proposed the same intervention that we had done in Gaziantep, Turkey, to bring together a group of displaced archaeologists, curators, and activists and talk about what kind of cultural heritage needed to be preserved, what to do when the military campaign began to retake Mosul, and what needed to be done. And there was some more active training here, and you're looking at the results of one of the final exercises to this class. All the participants were given an object and told to wrap it for evacuation using only the contents in their dorm room, with prizes given to the objects most likely to make it through an ISIS checkpoint. And and in case you're wondering what won the award, it was the cuneiform tablet hidden in a box of tampons. There's a certain degree of creativity actually required here. I mean, for the kind of conservation niche specialty that deals with first aid for culture, as Ikram talks about it, these are all active considerations. And where this boils down to now is parts of Mosul have been retaken. And this is our colleague Layla Saleh, who is the director of the Antiquities Service for the Nineveh Plain. And she was able to revisit the site at Nimrud, which many of you know was destroyed by ISIS 2 years ago now. She's also been able to visit Nebi Yunus and was most recently at the Mosul Museum. And so for those of you who've seen the photographs that have appeared internationally or the video feed that's appeared about the Mosul Museum, that's actually Layla's video feed. And so in many ways the SHOSI project extends here and is how do we support Layla in the moment that is coming right now, putting that museum back together, trying to figure out how to do emergency conservation work at Nimrud and at Nebi Yunus. And in some ways, these are very sort of dumb sorts of things. They're like, how do you get tarps on top of the destroyed mud brick that's just been exposed, so that way it doesn't erode in the first rain, right? I mean, this is not a lot of money we're talking about here, but it is a lot of logistics. Because it's not as if there's a lot of tarps suddenly sitting around Mosul that are available to do this kind of work, or Erbil for that matter. And so this is in many ways, I think of the Syrian-Iraq project in many ways as the same as I said before as what's going on with Shasta, what's going on in Mexico, but without the archaeologists on the ground per se. It's about me talking to Layla at 3:30 in the morning, which I was last night, trying to figure out how to get the resources that we have been able to get to her in Erbil now to where she is in Mosul in order to be able to do the most good immediately. And I think that in many ways, I think that this project is an example of where the future of community-based heritage really is, because it is involved, it really is about empowerment at the end of the day. It's about me in the position that I occupy at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, at this Heritage Center, being able to say, I'm not in control of this project, and you know what? I'm really comfortable with that. My intellectual contribution here is in helping the community members who are most affected by their local heritage being able to protect the heritage that they are able to protect and they want to protect, at these moments of need, whether it's conflict, whether it's post-conflict in the other two cases, even at extended removes of time, but really focusing on that very, very initial question: what is it that the community wants here? So with that, I'll end, and I'll be happy to take any questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, that was fascinating. How does your work, do you work with the World Monuments Fund and other private organizations?
The short answer is yes, I think we do. I mean, yes, we do. But I think the approach here is a little bit different than the WMF's traditional approach. So in many ways, the WMF has prioritized high-profile sites that are also identified in conjunction with ministries of culture, likely in more stable circumstances. Our contact with the WMF has been a dialogue about how we help coordinate efforts into these different kinds of spaces, especially in the kind of conflict setting. I mean, how you actually deal with that emergency response where it may not be the internationally prioritized project, right? And that's a bit of a shift in paradigm for how the WMF operates, but I think it's one that, with the recent transitions at WMF, that they're happily exploring as well.
I was fascinated by the Yucatan material. You must be familiar with McDuff Everton's book on modern Maya,
Yeah.
photographs, which he's just brought up to date. I don't know if you know. It's
I didn't know that.
a new version with amazing other photographs. But he has managed to document. He did the ancient ruins too, with big photographs. And, but he's managed to document this local community for everybody, and he was very interested in the modern work they're doing, so that they totally welcomed him. He's been going back and forth for 40 years. He's got godchildren there.
Yeah.
He got married, and there was this poignant story he wrote to me because I was very interested in his work, and this is when I was at the Book Museum, and we bought some of his photographs. That he said he was getting married, and he wrote to this person he'd always stayed with. Houses have nothing. They sleep in a hammock. There's a tiny TV. And then there's these home altars, which are really fascinating for him, that you never get to see them, what they're like in that region. And actually, the picture of Jesus Christ is as big as the Maya man sitting, in front of the TV at the door. But he said they had no understanding of distance or time, so they'd gone out and bought 25 turkeys to celebrate his. He said he was coming to see them, after his wedding, to celebrate his wedding with his local friends. When he finally arrived a month later, they were impressed. But he also documented these the ceremonies, like for Chak, the rainbow, and this mixture of saints and Maya gods. But it's kept very secret and protected, and they do these temporary altars. So it's incredible to have a photographic record of a great leafy arch, and then stacks of the men are separated from the women. The men do the earth ovens, just the way described in the ancient Maya text. The women do the food inside, and then they all have this feast. But the tortillas are stacks of tower with one has got a cross on the top, and the other stack has dots to represent the agricultural field, the size of the field. They always have to do this ceremony for the rain before they plant. And it's amazing that these have stayed absolutely intact. And there's always what they call, the word translates into shaman, but it's not really correct. It's not related to the shaman at all. But I found it very fascinating. And they have trouble when they go, with the task force, the ones on the other side that are Christian totally.
Yeah. And
they have those talking crosses dressed in peels with these amazing, again, sort of red images around the neck of it. But that can be very hostile there. That's
that split is exceptionally hostile.
Right.
And the Tihosuco community is much more on the Talking Cross side
Yes.
of that particular
I see.
of that piece. The what I will say is that one element of the project that I did not talk about, and Richard has been handling this, is actually a negotiation. Is probably a diplomatic negotiation is maybe the best way of describing it, across that bridge around a couple of the Talking Cross sites that are in the greater area, but which there are more traditionalist claims to, or management of, I guess is a better way of saying it. And I think that, that reflects a lot of the issues that are, in these spaces, and why I pointed out that picture of Richard talking. There's not a lot of pictures of me talking. You saw a picture of Salam talking, but it's talking where you're listening. And it's oftentimes about building trust in order to be able to deal with these kinds of broader, sometimes religious conflict or interpolitical conflict and so on, be able to implement a project. But I think fundamentally there's another piece that's very important here, that goes beyond just the specific context of the Yucatan. And it's why engage in this kind of local work, right? We have high priority sites that are damaged and destroyed too, or need preservation attention. And I think that this goes back to my remarks at the very start about where we are at right now in public humanities, and about actually making the public humanities relevant. The project of archaeology, the project of historic preservation, in case you all didn't see the news, is under great risk right now because the value is not seen. And there's oftentimes a lot of pushback from the local communities that we're talking about right here, or in the case of our Talking Crosses versus our traditionalists, to the act of preservation. So how do you overcome that? Well, I think that one of the things that we've seen, and this is, this is Chris Roosevelt and Christina Luke's project in Lydia in Turkey, where they've seen this, and I think this is absolutely dead on, is that if you're able to start with local community-based work and show why that's important and relevant and can be done and be really engaged, it's easier at the local community level to make the political pitch and diplomacy and agreement to be able to do work that goes beyond the immediate local concern. Maybe you can move to that other archaeological site that you as an archaeologist might be interested in. But unless you actually are starting by taking seriously what the local concerns are, I think that the entire project of what we do as preservationists is in a lot of trouble.
Well, I also wanted to talk, I also had worked with the Zuni, and I went before the Zuni Tribal Council to get permission to do this exhibition I did on the human records that I found at Brooklyn, and that whole collection that was very early on. And we actually had the photographs of some of the war gods and caves that helped the Zuni win a land claim, because they did the geographic search and saw that that was part of their sacred borders there. And there was a bit of a backlash after then. There'd been all these people, with SHOSI, and the Zuni was very open-ended. Wilson wrote on it, people participated, etc. When I went before the tribal council, I wanted to meet the Nohomai family for making ceramics so that we could have a show, a dialogue and tradition show, which I did with Ira Jackness when the Objects of Vivid Memory show was on. And they were, some of them didn't speak English. There was one woman, she'd just been elected to the tribal council the year before, and she loved my dress, so that made it sort of broke the ice. But at the end, they didn't mention anything about the workhouse, and this was pre-NAGPRA. But at the end, the head priest said that they would certainly help me, and it was fine for them to work with this stuff, but show this. And but they said, if you think you can do away with what Frank Hamilton Cushing got away with, you're mistaken. So, among other things, I found Frank Hamilton Cushing's Zuni shirt, the one that he's wearing in the Aikens portrait. And it was in the bottom of a box of Venezuelan textiles somewhere in storage. Nobody had ever dealt with this stuff. It had just come in and stayed in boxes. So it took 10 years to get it all together and stuff like that. But subsequently, and we brought all the Zuni, you had to have a man and a woman because some things the women couldn't look at, the men couldn't look at. And that was absolutely true. They were still practicing that. Ed Ladd, who was a PhD in anthropology, he ended up getting disowned by them, even though there were pictures that he drew in the Zuni Cultural Center as a little boy. He'd been very valuable to me because I think they felt threatened that they didn't know what he knew about their culture or something, and they sort of resented that. And then we had all these Zuni come for these, to see things and to help us and go through these big documents. And they didn't like hotels, so we put them up in people's local houses in Brooklyn. There were some very nice houses, and great friendships were formed. But after that, when we managed to return 13 Worgots before 9/11, and I got the Zuni. I was working with a very nice archaeologist then that was helping, that then got dismissed too because they felt he had taken over. So I know this thing about outsider people, they're very cautious. But I realized I couldn't really stand in front of the board and say why these were so sacred. I mean, the Zuni were saying that's the reason for the Vietnam War, this is the reason for that. So I asked them, and there was a young intern who worked in films, and he said, could we ask them to do a video with the elders talking? Which they did. They were talking in Zuni, so I thought, well, the board's going to give me back a few boarding, but it was also way too long. So he and I sort of made it into 10 minutes, and everybody was convinced. But really all the Zuni care about is the continuity of the language, and I wanted to know how important that was in these communities. They didn't want to lose the language. Their young people were no longer speaking Zuni.
I mean, I think in all of these heritage preservation cases, I mean, in every single one, including Syria and Iraq, the language issue is actually quite paramount. So it's a concern among, as you saw with the language program in the Yucatan project. It is a concern for the Shasta and language preservation there. What's curious is it's also a major concern in Iraq, and not necessarily in Arabic, but among minority religious communities that actually speak, Syrian, right? And one of the things that happened very early on in the ISIS conflict in Iraq, and I suspect this happened in Syria as well, but has not been documented as a phenomenon, was that the displacement of the dry farmers that were on the Nineveh plain to Germany, effectively, very early on in the conflict, meant that all of the farmers suddenly disappeared, with all of the traditional knowledge about how to do dry farming on the Nineveh plain as it has been practiced for millennia. All of a sudden, the people with the knowledge bearers were suddenly missing, and refugees. Moreover, what we began to see in some of these Assyrian communities was that the knowledge, the basic semantic domains about plant life, biological life on the plain were actually not known. Because this was a specialized register of knowledge, oftentimes held only within specific villages that were now either massacred by ISIS or themselves displaced. How this is actually dealt with in these kinds of spaces, the communities are themselves reacting to this, going, oh my word, where did this knowledge go? Can we actually find some of these speakers? Can we document what this was? If we can never go back, and even if we can't go back, can we at least document what this was? This is a question on everybody's mind. And I think it's also reflective that in the emergency response context of Syria and Iraq, it's really, really, really hard to do the kind of emergency building conservation or site conservation I was telling you about. We haven't even begun to actually imagine how we deal with these other kinds of more intangible heritage issues. I'm not overly fond of that term, but just call it for the moment provisionally. We haven't begun to think about how we actually do and address some of the same questions. Do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, and we're running out of time. I think Brian will be around for a little bit if anybody wants to continue this conversation, but I know many of us have obligations usually around 1:30. So thank you so much for coming today, and let's thank him for sharing his project.